This video is brought to you by News Voice. The news is broken. Almost all of the US media is owned by just a handful of massive corporations. Fake news is obviously a huge problem as well, and finding something unbiased can be really hard. News Voice is revolutionizing the news landscape. It's an app that gives you a personalized news feed by aggregating major news sites as well as international and independent media, giving some much needed balance. Each news story shows multiple sources, which are all tagged with their bias and perspective. The news affects almost everything in our lives. What we hear and what we read shapes which people we trust, what we eat, what we buy, how we vote, and even how we think. News Voice is created by its readers, as you can upvote stories that you find interesting so more people will see them. It is essentially a democratized platform for news. Plus, it saves you time. You get all the news and all the sources in one app so that you can be better informed. And it's totally free. Anyway, get started with News Voice today for free through the link below. It's available on both Google Play and the Apple App Store. And now, let's get into the video. It seems that anything could happen this year, 2020. For example, 50 years after the Vietnam War, the United States Army is returning to Vietnam. But instead of going to attack Vietnamese communists, this time they're going to defend them. Check this out.
USS Theodore Roosevelt arrives in Vietnam, becoming second US carrier to visit since the 1970s. Stars and Stripes.
The Socialist Republic of Vietnam is one of the few officially communist countries left in the world. Its flag is even red with a 5-pointed star in the middle. And on its northern border is the People's Republic of China, which is also ruled by a single party, the Communist Party of China. In other words, both countries have very similar political systems. Both countries also began implementing free market reforms in the 1980s. Both countries are home to the factories of the world. Those countries share a common border. With so many things in common, you think that China and Vietnam would be natural allies, wouldn't you? Well, my dear friends of VisualPolitik, nothing could be further from the truth.
As Vietnam takes more assertive approach to the South China Sea, Beijing tries to manage tensions. South China Morning Post.
To give you an idea, in the last 5 years alone, China and Vietnam have each launched several cyber attacks. The last one was just a few months ago. Some Vietnamese hackers stole data about COVID-19 from the Chinese government. Meanwhile, China was responsible for sinking some Vietnamese fishing boats. The main reason was disputes about the control of some tiny islands in the South China Sea. That's right, some tiny islands. At the end of this video, you will understand why they are so important. And you'll say, well, that's a very unbalanced conflict, isn't it, Grant? And there is some truth to that. Vietnam is a country of more than 96 million people, which has been growing at almost an average rate of 7% for 10 years. However, these numbers pale in comparison to the more than 1 billion people in China. Take this example. The Chinese Navy has 59 submarines and 59 frigates. The Vietnamese Navy has 8 submarines and 4 frigates. So what's the superpower propping up Vietnam? Well, it's none other than Uncle Sam. And the question is, why is there so much tension between Vietnam and China? What is happening in the South China Sea? And how is it possible that the United States, which was Vietnam's worst enemy, is becoming its best ally? Today, we will answer all these questions. But first, as always, let's take a look at some history.
Comrades of convenience.
In 1954, Vietnam became independent from, not Britain, as is usually the case, but France. Until then, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia had all been part of what was known then as French Indochina. After the Indochina War, Vietnam was divided into 2 halves. Sound familiar? The Communist North and the South, which was an ally of the United States. As had happened in the Korean Peninsula, a completely arbitrary dividing line was used. In this case, the 17th parallel. As you can probably imagine, the Northern Communists, led by Ho Chi Minh, had the support of Mao's China, and that support continued during the Vietnam War. The one that we all know about. The one where the North and South of Vietnam fought for total control of the country for a whopping 20 years. as you know, the United States supported the South and China supported the North, without a second thought. To give you a rough idea, over the course of the entire war, China sent the communists in Vietnam 560 tanks, 164 fighter planes, and 1,922,000 pistols. But none of this will surprise you, will it? It is logical that a communist country like the People's Republic of China supported the Viet Cong. And it would be logical to think that, after the victory of communism in Vietnam, China would become an ally of this country. What should have been an unbreakable alliance was cut short by this man.
Better to kill an innocent by mistake than spare an enemy by mistake. Pol Pot, Cambodian dictator.
The man who you just saw on your screen is Pol Pot, the man who ordered the greatest genocide in history. And no, I am not exaggerating even a little bit. Pol Pot established a communist dictatorship in Cambodia in 1976, the Khmer Rouge dictatorship. The Khmer Rouge believed that the only way to end capitalism was by eliminating all of its institutions and the people who worked in them. Only in this way could a collectivist society be built from scratch. Something like wiping the whole country and starting again. For example, school teachers were accused of being intellectuals who perpetuated individualistic ideals. So the Khmer Rouge didn't hesitate in executing all of them. And we're not just talking about teachers. Businessmen, lawyers, infertile women, sick people, basically everyone who was not useful for the society that Pol Pot wanted to build was executed. In total, the Cambodian genocide wiped out almost 25% of the population. But, take a deep breath, let's get back to our story. As you can imagine, China had also supported the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and at first, the Khmer Rouge also supported the Viet Cong. They were all communist comrades, fighting together against the oppressors of the West. However, if you think that having ideology in common is enough to form a lasting relationship, then boy oh boy, are you wrong. The moment the United States left the region, Pol Pot began to mistrust the Vietnamese. The Khmer Rouge wanted a communist Cambodia, but in their own way. They didn't want Vietnam, which is a much larger country, to get involved in their affairs. Pol Pot began by purging all of the Khmer Rouge who had been trained in Vietnam. And for such a fanatical man, executing thousands of fellow party members was not difficult. Later, the Cambodian Khmers engaged in a series of skirmishes on the border with the Vietnamese. So, what did Vietnam do? Well, in 1978, Vietnam invaded Cambodia and drove out the Khmer Rouge. And this is where we have to take a step back to break down the partnerships we have in play here. Let's give you some background. Vietnam was an ally of the Soviet Union, but China was moving away from the Kremlin because they wanted to maintain their sovereignty. At the same time, China was supporting Cambodia and beginning to establish diplomatic relations with the United States. In other words, China could no longer allow Vietnam to invade Cambodia because Cambodia was its ally. So, in 1979, China started a war with Vietnam. From 1954 to 1979, Vietnam was constantly at war. First with the French, then with the United States, then with Cambodia, and finally with China. In fact, it was precisely in these years that the gap between Marxist-Leninists and Maoists was occurring all over the world. That is, on the one hand, there were communist parties that remained faithful to the USSR, and other communist parties that defended the interests of China. To give you an idea, the directives of the Chinese Communist Party were translated into various languages, from English to Spanish, and sent to the Maoist parties of all countries around the globe. In this way, the militants knew what Beijing's position was at any given moment. For example, their attitude to Vietnam. The Sino-Vietnamese War left more than 60,000 dead on both sides, and both China and the United States put all kinds of trade sanctions on Vietnam. Meanwhile, Vietnam continued to invade Cambodia. As an example, in 1986, every Cambodian minister had a Vietnamese advisor at his or her side, and a third of Vietnam's military spending was going on maintaining the occupation of Cambodia. In other words, if you think that only European countries have created colonies, then you are wrong. Although, let's be fair, it is true that the Vietnamese army did dispose of the regime responsible for the greatest genocide in history, whereas when Europe came knocking in other places, usually that was the other way around. The largest genocide, of course, in terms of the population of their country. But don't think for a second that they brought freedom and democracy with them. Indeed, until the mid-1980s, the Vietnamese government followed Marxism-Leninism to its predictable final consequences, and the Vietnamese economy was collapsing. However, all that changed in 1986. That year, the more moderate factions of Vietnamese communism took power, and that's how the policy of the Doi Moi began, which we covered in another video. Basically, Doi Moi was a program of free market reforms similar to what China was also doing at the time. And in addition to freeing up its economy, Vietnam focused on improving its relations with the rest of the world. All of this explains why, in 1989, Vietnam pulled out of Cambodia. Gradually, relations with China improved. In both Beijing and Hanoi, they focused on economic growth and trade, and so they continued for decades, collaborating on projects like this one.
Cross-border highway linking China and Vietnam concludes trial run. China Daily.
That news story is from 2018. We're talking about a highway that connects Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, with Kunming, which is a southern Chinese city. At the time, this highway was a symbol of reconciliation. Finally, these two countries, which destiny was calling to understand each other, were united by a common road. And you're probably thinking, well, problem solved there. Where is this conflict now? Well, let's take a look at that right now.
Contentious islands.
Pay attention to this map. Here we can see the South China Sea. Viewed from afar, it seems pretty clear where each country's territorial waters reach. The rest would be considered international waters, right? Well, you are wrong. If we zoom in, we find a lot of tiny islands. It looks a little bit like God sneezed on the map. Well, these islands are the Spratly and Paracel Islands. Actually, strictly speaking, we couldn't even call them islands as such, but as coral atolls. An atoll is a ring-shaped island formed by, you guessed it, coral. If you look closely at the photos, you will see that the 130 coral atolls of the Paracel Islands have barely any surface area. To give you an idea, the combined land territory of these islands is just 7.75 kilometers squared, and the highest point is 14 meters. Many of them couldn't even be walked on. However, technically, they are territories, and therefore susceptible to belonging to one country or another. Until 1932, it was assumed that they belonged to China. Then they became part of French Indochina. Later, Japan invaded them, and now their ownership is in dispute with China and neighbouring countries. And I know at this point what you're probably thinking, but who cares about coral atolls? I mean, apart from fish, obviously. Who's going to fight over something like that? But the truth is that they matter a lot. First of all, there are known oil and gas deposits in the area. Therefore, if these atolls are part of a country's territory, that country can extract the oil in surrounding waters without any problem. After all, the oil is within their territorial waters. But we're not just talking about oil. Think about it. These islands are the perfect place to put military bases. If China took over the Paracel Islands, it could set up military ports to control all of the trade in the area. Roughly 1/3 of all international trade is concentrated in Southeast Asia. It is one of the most booming areas in the world. All those ships loaded with Apple AirPods, Samsung mobiles, and so many other products made in Vietnam have to pass through here. But if China had a row of military bases at the gates of Vietnam, it could block all exports in the blink of an eye. Vietnam has brought to light laws that say these islands belong to them. China has done the same. And since no country recognizes the other's laws, it's the actions that matters. And that's why news like this is so important.
China to build school in contested Paracel Islands. BBC. China showcases jet fighters at South China Sea Island. Global Times.
And at this point, I know what you're thinking. How did they build those things? Didn't we say just a second ago that these are coral atolls where there's hardly any firm surface? Well, what the Chinese have done is start building artificial islands. For example, one of these atolls is the so-called Fiery Cross Reef. In this case, the satellite image shows how China has been covering the space in the center with sand brought in by ships. In a few years, atolls that only had a large lake in the center have been turned into small islands. Islands that, in some cases, have been converted into missile silos. According to many analysts, it is almost impossible for China to build a large military base in the area. The small land area and climate make it virtually impossible to install large missile systems or military ports. Even so, in Vietnam, they are really scared.
Vietnam breaks up anti-China protests, BBC.
As you can imagine, these protests were not spontaneous. They're supported by the Vietnamese government itself. But don't think that this is all a political game. Of course, Mr. Xi Jinping and his Vietnamese counterpart, Nguyen Phu Trong, do not get along. But many Vietnamese fishermen have been attacked by Chinese boats. In fact, in 2020, China even sunk a fishing boat in the Paracel Islands. And we are not just talking about skirmishes. Chinese hackers have attacked the computer systems of the Vietnamese government. And with the coronavirus crisis, Vietnamese hackers did the same with China. In this case, they wanted to get data on the pandemic. But, as you might have figured out by now, no matter how many hackers Hanoi has, they cannot compete with the hackers in Beijing. And that is why Vietnam is also leading the conflict by more civilized methods. Check this out.
Vietnam threatens China with litigation over the South China Sea. Lawfare.
You can probably imagine what they're thinking about this in China. Oh no, I'm so scared. Vietnam has reported us. We'll have to find a lawyer. Maybe we should stop building artificial islands. We might get a fine. And it's at this point that the game of alliances changes again. Pay attention here, because this is when it all starts happening.
The American Friend.
In the year 2000, Vietnam and the United States signed a trade agreement. After decades of enmity, these two countries were back on good terms. 20 years later, Apple is already manufacturing its AirPods in Vietnamese factories, and thousands of Americans make business trips to cities like Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City. Among others, this particular American citizen, whose name I'm sure you all know.
Trump says second summit with North Korea's Kim Jong-un will be in Hanoi, NBC News.
The fact that Vietnam was chosen as the setting for this summit is no coincidence. In his 4 years in office, Donald Trump has visited Vietnam twice, and the Vietnamese diaspora loves Donald Trump. To give you an idea, in 2016, the Pew Research Center carried out a survey in different countries asking about citizens' perception of capitalism. According to this survey, the most pro-capitalist country in the world is Vietnam. According to this study, the Vietnamese are more pro-capitalist than the Americans themselves. But we are not only talking about ideology. Here too, there are concrete actions.
Aircraft carrier Roosevelt will visit Vietnam this week. USNI News from July 2020.
This is the second time in 2 years that an American aircraft carrier has docked in a Vietnamese port. And this is striking because before 2018, the last time a US aircraft carrier passed through the area was in the 1970s. So what is going on? Well, the reasons behind the United States sending aircraft carriers to Vietnam should be very clear. They are supporting Vietnam in the face of China's expansion. And, as you can probably imagine, Beijing has not been standing idly by. Just this summer, the Chinese army conducted naval exercises in the area. But make no mistake, this is not just a fight between Vietnam and China. There are many countries that are getting seriously frightened by the expansionism of Beijing, from Japan to India to Taiwan. However, Vietnam could be a strategic ally for the United States. First, they are perfectly positioned to be able to install military bases with which to control the area. In addition, Vietnam is one of the big winners of the coronavirus economic crisis. They have managed their virus response in such a way that it has hardly affected them at all. At the time of making this video, only 35 people had died and only 1,000 had been infected. Clearly, they could be a valuable ally in the trade war with China. But these are all topics for other videos. Now, as always, the questions are over to you. Will we see an open war between China and Vietnam? Do you think that US support for Vietnam could result in the country having a democracy? You can leave your answers in the comments below. And of course, don't forget that here at VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already, and if you haven't, why not? And hit the bell down there so you don't miss any of our other updates. If you like this video, please give us a like, and we'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.